Good evening. My name is David, and I'll be doing your presentation and informing you on the potential positives and negatives of investing within Apple, and kind of just giving you an all-encompassing view of really what you would be investing in and if it would fit you. So let's start this off here. A little bit of background on Apple itself. So the quote up here, to make a contribution to the world and making tools for the mind that advance humankind. This phrase was actually coined by Steve Jobs back in 1980 when the company was originally just getting started. Now, Apple was founded in 1976, so this was a couple years down the road here. This phrase would really become the foundation, the building blocks off of which Apple was built and the culture that it would ultimately create. And Steve Jobs, and he was young, I highly doubt he ever thought about, running a Fortune 500 company or making the type of impact that he did or becoming a household name. I mean, all of these things are probably the furthest from his mind when he originally started the company. So let's go through kind of what that looked like, because it advanced rather quickly and rapidly, and he made quite an impact in a very short amount of time. So like I said, started in 1976, excuse me, in order for Steve Jobs and his partner Steve Wozniak to actually get off the ground and get running, Steve Jobs had to sell his car and Wozniak a couple of his personal possessions, a high-tech calculator, and a couple other tech gadgets of his, in order to actually get funding in order to actually make their dream a reality. Now, this propelled them into the year 1977, when they actually created a color display. And this was the very first color display that was ever created for a computer. And not only that, but they also used a custom plastic casing. This made it lighter, which is far better than the metal casings they had at the time. And the color display had an appeal to the actual consumer of that day. So it was less of just a necessity and more of a want at that point, or maybe balancing the two. So that opened doors for them dramatically. At this point, Steve Jobs realized that they had a wonderful product in hand, but they also needed the individuals which could take them to the next level and really bring their product to light and really help them capitalize and grow their market share. That's where Regis McKenna came into play. He was a very well-known PR businessman at the time, and he agreed to help represent their business and help bring them into the center spotlight of the tech world and the growing technologies of that day and time. He also needed more funding to really make this happen, fuel this dream. And that's where Michael Mikola came into play. He was a bigwig at the Intel processors, and Intel processors has been around for a very long time, even before Apple, and he agreed to invest in Apple, this startup company, in exchange for a seat of power and influence, as well as a sizable amount of Apple stock. And with his funds and the help of Regis McKenna, they really jumped forward. They really just jumped forward in time and really were able to focus on developing their products instead of just merely developing the culture side of it. It began to kind of develop itself. In 1979, Steve Wozniak actually developed the first floppy disk, which allowed programmers and coders and recreational users alike to store and move data at a much faster rate than was previously accessible. This made it wildly popular among consumer crowds. And this was really when that culture started to really take off and build. And then in the 1990s, just fast forwarding here a little bit, Steve Jobs had or Apple, I should say, not Steve Jobs, had a very strong footing in the education or the consumer arena, but he realized that the educational arena was where the movement was going, where things were going to move. Now, at that time, he needed a way to get into and penetrate that market share. It was already being saturated by other competitors at the time. In order to do this, what he did was obviously offer a very comparable product, if not superior product, but he also offered donations and discounts, all for the name of education. This created a cause behind the product, and this enabled him to get a strong foothold, so much so that he ended up pushing out other competition and taking a very strong central hold in the educational market at the time. Now, this all led up to 2000, the beginning of a new millennium. And Apple, over the course of the time that it started, so 24 years essentially, till 2000, was now earning $8 billion in gross income and $786 million net. And that's all from the course of 24 years, since their start to that 2000 turn. That's incredible. That's an incredible amount of growth for such a small company. So as we can see here, Apple is a very innovative and very aggressive competitor in the tech market that provides a very substantial product. Apologize for that. All right, now moving on to the next here, just kind of going over a little bit about what they sell. They did start originally with just laptop computers. However, this diagram shows you how the products that they offer became more diverse to fit their client share and their market share. You can see here, you have the laptops, you have the desktop computers, and all of these kind of went in their own different directions, with the iPads, laptops, and desktop computers making more advancements and splitting off into different, more specialized areas of need that can help suit both client and business needs. So you can kind of see everything here that it divvies out. The main products that they offer are the Apple Watch, which is used for telling time and various other things communication-wise. You have the iPhone, very self-explanatory, the telephone communication system, their flagship smartphone. You have the MacBook and MacBook Pros. These are their laptops used for graphics design, editors, authors, all on the go. And if you need a little bit more power, they also have the Mac. It's their desktop. And this is generally used for more labor-intensive video editing, software editing, music, but that requires more power. So those are kind of the way that their lines divvy out. There's some more specialized niches within those, but that's essentially a general idea of how everything divvies out. So really definitely took a step forward since the beginning to present day. Now, what you're really concerned with here is stock performance. This all sounds great, and it's a wonderful story about how a startup was able to start at the very bottom and rise to the very top, almost like an underdog story. But ultimately, as an investor, you're wondering, how does this affect you? What is their stock performance? It's actually quite favorable. If we look back at the original start date, when Apple became a public company back in the 80s, their stocks started out at 62 cents a share. Now, fast forward to October 2006, Apple stocks started to climb into the double digits, and they did not drop below. Again, they continued to climb. They did obviously have their uptrends and downtrends, but they did rise relatively quickly. Now, current day, you can get Apple stock for $216 a share, so definitely a huge increase. There are 4.83 billion outstanding shares of Apple stock at $216 a share. The last dividend that was just recorded was 73 cents per share. It may not seem like a lot. However, this represents about a 23.69% growth rate, which is phenomenal, especially within a company of that size, because you're looking at stability and you're also looking at a very impressive growth rate. So definitely something to consider when you're looking at the stocks and potentially investing within this company. So that would be something to take into consideration and ponder until the end of this presentation. Now, let's dive into the company that you'd be investing in here. We have the core competencies. Now, this is essentially what you would be looking at and what you would be investing in terms of the qualities of your company. How is the company run? What do they believe in? What are their values? It all comes down to their core competencies. And do they develop these? That would be a very good question, because ultimately, if these are developed, your company, and they're developed in the right way, your company is going to thrive. If they're neglected, your company is going to suffer, and ultimately it's going to affect your investment. So it's crucial that you understand this. Now, Apple, ever since its beginning, similar to the quote that we looked at the very beginning of this presentation here, is dedicated to innovation and creativity in a modern world. Now, Apple is very unlike a lot of its competitors. It actually believes in synergistic democratic leadership. It doesn't believe in hierarchy in terms of the traditional sense. It believes in allowing its employees the free rein to develop and really fine-tune ideas collectively as a team. Now, this is open. This open line of communication goes from the very top of the CEO and leaders similar to him, all the way down to graphics designers and the like. So anybody in Apple has the ability to bring wonderful and innovative ideas to the table, and they do this on purpose because they believe that within collaboration and synergistic meetings and relationships, new and invigorating ideas can come forward. And that's really ultimately how Apple has really pushed its way and continued to push its way in the realm of innovation, thus putting it at the helm of its niche. So it's really something you want to take into consideration. They value their employees, they value their people, they value their input, and they strive for excellence. Now, this ultimately creates a work environment of respect and loyalty and innovation. All of these are key, because if you have happy employees and you have innovation, you have a thriving company that's propelling forward, and while propelling forward, it's also propelling your investment and ideally the returns, which is good for you. So definitely something to kind of keep at the back of your mind there. Now, moving on to Apple and its employees. Now, what you're going to notice is not unlike what we've been looking at here. It's very different, it's very new, it's very fresh. It's not similar to the way other companies run things. Apple never pushes sales numbers. They don't push these for a very good reason. If you push sales, it becomes all about the product. If you push people, it's going to become all about the person. So what they do is they use the acronym APPLE. Essentially, in a nutshell, what this breaks down to is the employees listening, sympathizing, understanding, presenting solutions, and addressing any concerns that potential patrons might have regarding their products. Now, their goal is not to pitch the product. Their goal is to listen to these patrons and satisfy certain needs or make their lives better in certain areas, not to sell the product. And in doing so, the employees are able to make the customers feel appreciated and therefore generate business and move products for Apple in the end, as well as building a very strong, tight niche relationship with that customer, which will ultimately most likely end in a repeat sale. This is due to the fact that Apple puts people above product. And that is key when you're looking at investing in a company, because this won't just sell a product for a day and give you returns short term, it'll give you returns long term, because this culture that they're building and these loyal customers are ultimately going to repeat and come back and do this again and again, and therefore give you repeat dividends. So that's something that I would also take into consideration, because the business culture has a high effect on how you're ultimately going to see your returns in the long run. Apple's leadership. This is a picture of Apple's senior leadership, and their style is very similar to what we discussed. They are the ones who actually implemented and continue to implement the style of democratic synergistic leadership. These are the individuals responsible for ensuring that their employees have what they need to create the Apple difference, to create the experience and the culture that we've all come to know and appreciate about Apple. And this is ultimately, if you look at Apple products and you look at Apple culture, they're really one and the same. And I would actually go so far as to say that the culture is more well known than the product, because Apple creates a tight knit team of employees and they ultimately create very loyal followers. And this is good for you, like I said before, because it creates repeat buyers. Now, this all sounds well and good, but what are the numbers behind that? What are the numbers that back up all of these claims? Well, let's take a look at the finances from 2017. So we'll take a look at the balance sheet here first. The assets and liabilities stand neck and neck at 3.75.319 billion apiece. Now, this is really important to understand that when going over these are crucial when making your decisions about whether or not to invest, because these numbers are going to back up everything that we just discussed, and they're going to show you that everything in this presentation holds water. If this said something completely different, then obviously everything that I was saying would not stand up to the test and therefore should make you leery. So let's dive into this and see what you have to think. The balance sheet, liabilities and assets. Now, these should always match and these should always be equal. Neither one should ever exceed the other, especially liabilities to assets. That would essentially mean the company is in poor financial health. So what we're looking at here is a balanced, healthy, thriving business. And if we take a little bit deeper look at the liabilities here and the assets, we can see that in terms of assets, there is about $128.65 billion in current assets. Now, these are assets that can be readily available and converted into cash very quickly. So that's good. It means we have a fair amount of capital to work with if there was something that was to happen. Now, in terms of liabilities, we have long-term debt sitting at $97.27 billion and accounts payable at $74.793 billion. Now, this is a really nice balanced overview when looking at liabilities. The accounts payable, this is eventually going to come to fruition. Now, even though it's still technically a liability, it will come to fruition and it will be counted toward the company's positive returns eventually. And then also, its long-term debt is relatively minimal compared to its assets, which is also a good sign. It doesn't have zero debt, which is not desirable, but it also doesn't have an astronomical amount of debt. It has a very neutral amount of debt, which is desirable for a solid, sturdy investment. Now going down and looking at the income statement here, we have total revenues at $229.234 billion, gross revenues at $88.186 billion, and then we have net income at $48.351 billion. So total revenue is going to give you an idea of everything that's come in, and that's an astronomical amount of money. That's a staggering amount. However, we're going to be a little more interested in the gross revenue here. This is going to show you after all the expenses were paid here, what we're looking at between the gross revenue and the net income. So after all the operating expenses were paid, after all the taxes were paid, all of that was said and done, we still ended up with $48.351 billion, which is what we're looking at when we're taking in consideration dividends. So that number is very important to potential investors. Now, we're looking at cash flow as well. This is something you're always going to want to see as positive within a business. And Apple is sitting at a positive $195 billion in cash flow, which is good. Anything negative would be a bad investment. And this shows you, essentially what the cash flow does is going to show you how your business, how the money flows through your business. And if you're at a negative, then you're losing money. Apple is clearly not losing money. So that is definitely, certainly desirable as an investor to see that. Now let's go down to what I like to call our litmus test. These are our ratios, and this shows us really what Apple has the capacity to do if it ever needed to in a short period of time. So current ratio, this is going to take into consideration all of our assets at Apple and compare them to our liabilities. Now, if, based off this current ratio, if Apple had to scrounge together enough money to pay back its liabilities in a hurry, it has 128% available to it, which means it has an excess 28% more than needed to pay back these liabilities, which means that after everything's said and done, Apple would still have a very healthy, well, at least somewhat healthy internal financial workings if something like that was to ever happen, which is good for you as an investor. You wouldn't necessarily lose your shirt, most likely. So then we have the quick ratio, and this is essentially going to look at the not necessarily all of the assets, but only the ones that are easily convertible into cash, and then compare those to the liabilities. And as we can see here, if we're taking out the long-term assets and we're just comparing short-term and cash, we're relatively pretty much on the same playing field there, which is good. Well, not good or bad. It should be relatively balanced, but this is within a stone's throw of one another, which is okay. Now, looking at the cash ratio, this one right here has a little bit of cause for concern. The reason being is because this is the cash on hand that a business has, that if needed, it could apply these to all the liabilities right then and there. Now, this is a large amount of cash. Usually businesses want to shoot for closer to 50%. They don't need to have this much excess cash on hand, generally speaking, because what that means is that the company could be investing it in something either short-term or long-term that would be gaining more interest for its shareholders, which would ultimately transition over into earned dividends. So it definitely makes you pause with 74% cash on hand. However, this can be justifiable if the company, in Apple's case, is working on something groundbreaking, something new, something that it's bringing to the table, that a new product line that would ultimately generate more income for the company and the shareholders. Now, Apple hasn't announced anything new, especially that we require that much capital on hand. However, we can't guess. Even if we think they may be working on something or they may have something on the books, we can't just guess and say that we think it would be this. We have to go by the hard, solid facts. And for that reason, I would say that this would cause me to pause as an investor, the 74%. Overall, I think that Apple has a very strong, stable, reliable history of growth and most likely experiencing years of continued innovation and growth in the future as well. They've always been very hardworking and very industrious and generally speaking ahead of the curve. So based off of these trends, I would say that it's very safe that if you were looking to invest in Apple and looking to put your funds in this area, that you would most likely be safe and satisfied with your investment. Now with all that being said and everything being discussed here, I would like to open the floor to questions.